1243 p.m. Our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant has been looking into the international relations ramifications of the potential fall of Robert Mugabe. For every dictator who does not die in office, there eventually comes a point of no return, some unpredictable moment when one's iron grip on power evaporates overnight. Robert Mugabe has just passed that point. The immediate question now seems to be how his retirement will be managed. There is immense respect for Robert Mugabe inside ZANU-PF, and officials in the ruling party have told The Telegraph that the military will try to handle things with dignity. He may be sent into exile, or allowed to continue as a figurehead president with little real power. The next question is how the international community will react. The African Union has a hardline policy of opposing the military coups that were once common across the continent, and as late as yesterday evening, the received wisdom among diplomats, analysts, and Zimbabwean businessmen was that the military wouldn't even dare taking things into their own hands. Zimbabwe is landlocked, and in such a fragile state economically that a blockade by South Africa, Zambia, and other neighbors could theoretically bring a junta to its knees in days. General Constantino Chiwenga appears to have called that bluff. For all their aversion to military interventions, Zimbabwe's neighbors have been increasingly worried by the country's ongoing economic collapse and the looming prospect of a messy transition when Mr. Mugabe dies or retires. If the current military intervention does not descend into violence, it provides an opportunity for a relatively peaceful transition. It also installs a man, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is well known to the political establishments in South Africa and Zambia, but also Britain, the former colonial power, and China, an increasingly influential player in Zimbabwe's economy. No government will risk endorsing what is in effect a military seizure of power, but as long as General Chiwenga maintains a veneer of constitutional respectability by not declaring himself president, avoiding bloodshed, and allowing Mr. Mugabe to retire quietly, don't expect the international community to kick up much of a fuss. It may be just the solution many were secretly hoping for. 1213 p.m. There are reports that the army has disarmed police in Harare in a bid to take full control of security in Zimbabwe. Fadzayi Harare, who was hoping to stand in elections to become an MP, took this picture today, claiming to show police being lined up in the street. It is thought that the army is aligned with Emmerson Mnangagwa, the sacked vice president, while the police are believed to be loyal to Grace Mugabe. 1206 p.m. Boris Johnson, the foreign secretary, has said it's very fluid and it's hard to say exactly how this will turn out. The most important point to make is that everybody wants to see a stable and successful Zimbabwe, and I think we are really appealing for everybody to refrain from violence. Emily Thornberry, the shadow foreign secretary, said it must ultimately be for the Zimbabwean people to determine their own future government through free, peaceful and democratic elections. 1203 p.m. The Democratic Alliance, South Africa's main opposition party, has called for Mr. Mugabe to step down and for free and fair elections to be held immediately. The current instability in Zimbabwe must be a cause for concern for all African countries who stand for democracy on the continent, DA party leader MMUSI Maimane said in a statement. 1138 a.m. President Mugabe was due to address state television at 11 a.m., it was thought. The broadcast has not taken place, but we are monitoring state TV and will video at the top of the page if we get it. 1134 a.m. Reports are circulating that President Mugabe's wife may have fled to Namibia. Eddie Cross, an opposition MP in Zimbabwe, has told BBC News that he believes Grace Mugabe has crossed the border to the west. Sky News were also told that Mrs. Mugabe had been allowed to leave the country by the military last night as tensions grew over the apparent internal power struggle that had paved the way for her to take over as vice president. Mrs. Mugabe is unlikely to choose South Africa for exile after facing allegations that she assaulted a model there earlier this year. 1125 a.m. The head of Zimbabwe's influential War Veterans Association says they stand with the army and that President Robert Mugabe should stand down as party leader of the ruling ZANU-PF. Victor Mtemedana told reporters in Harare that the country has been sliding into a state of chaos, adding that ZANU-PF should establish a commission of inquiry into Mugabe and why he decided to let his wife insult veterans and the armed forces. 1116 a.m. Mugabe was expected to address the nation at 11 a.m. but it appears to have been delayed. We are monitoring state TV and will broadcast at the top of the page when we get it. 1055 a.m. 1049 a.m. President Robert Mugabe is under house arrest in Zimbabwe, South African President Jacob Zuma has said in a statement. President Zuma spoke to President Robert Mugabe earlier today, who indicated that he was confined to his home but said that he was fine, the South African government said. 10:46 a.m. Robert Mugabe is due to address the nation in a broadcast on state TV. He is likely to clarify the situation after claims of a coup and suggestions that he is being held under house arrest with his wife Grace. Watch his full address at the top of this article. 10:39 a.m. James Duddridge, the Conservative MP, who was responsible for Zimbabwe at the Foreign Office between 2014 and 2016, said Britain should support a smooth transition. He said President Mugabe should be given a soft landing outside the country to allow a less bloody switch to a new government. Mr. Duddridge told the Press Association it is for the Zimbabwean people to chart a way forward, not Her Majesty's government. But I think they are doing that, they will do that, and we will support them coming out of what has been a rather nasty dictatorship by one man to a slightly more functioning democracy, probably transitioning by a government of national unity. But it may very well be that we need to provide support in the transition to maintain stability that is in the Zimbabwean people's interests, it is in the British national interest. He added, so I very much hope for a bloodless and peaceful transition from an autocratic dictator, who has served his time and needs to move on, to a more democratic, open nation-state that will trade and prosper and start to rejuvenate the Zimbabwean people. There's always a concern when there's a transition of power, but we must remember Mugabe is loved by many people around Africa as a revolutionary leader. But he's morphed from that into a rather distasteful dictator who has abused his position. Providing Mugabe with a soft landing outside of Zimbabwe, which, whilst is distasteful given everything that he has done and has been done in his name, will allow for a less bloody transition. 9:56 a.m. South Africa has urged neighbouring Zimbabwe to resist any unconstitutional changes of government. President Jacob Zuma wants Zimbabwe to resist unconstitutional change, credits Amaya Hisham. Reuters. President Jacob Zuma has expressed hope that developments in Zimbabwe would not lead to unconstitutional changes of government, according to a statement released in Pretoria. Zuma appealed for the country to resolve the political impasse amicably and has urged the Zimbabwean Defence Force to ensure the maintenance of peace. Millions of Zimbabweans have moved to South Africa to seek work and flee Mr. Mugabe's regime. 9:28 a.m. Robert Mugabe's legacy as one of the most ruthless tyrants of modern times may be finally coming to an end. His savage rule over Zimbabwe was dominated by murder, bloodshed, torture, persecution of political opponents, intimidation and voter rigging on a grand scale. Read our full profile of the Zimbabwean leader here. 9:21 a.m. Queues have formed outside banks in Harare as Zimbabweans scramble to withdraw their cash after military flooded the streets and reports of a coup spread. Zimbabweans queue to withdraw money in Harare. Credit PHILIMON Bulawayo. Reuters. School children seen passing military officers stationed across the capital. Credits Vangarai Mukwaji app. School children were also pictured on the way to class as armored vehicles and military personnel patrolled the roads across the capital. State radio has been replaying the military's announcement that President Mugabe is secure. The recordings have been interspersed between patriotic songs from the independence period of the 1980s, according to BBC monitoring. 8:01 a.m. China has said that Zimbabwe Military Chief General Constantino Chiwenga's visit to the country last week was a normal military visit. Mr. Chiwenga threatened to step in over the sacking of Zimbabwe's vice president last week. China is closely watching the situation in Zimbabwe and hopes that relevant parties can properly handle their internal affairs, Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang told the Daily News briefing this morning. Rumors are swirling that Robert Mugabe and his wife Grace have been offered safe passage to Singapore, but this could not be confirmed. 6:49 a.m. Zimbabwe's opposition Movement for Democratic Change (MDC) is calling for a peaceful return to constitutional democracy. The MDC, the main political challenger to Mugabe's ZANU-PF party for the last 2 decades, also said it hoped the military intervention would lead to the establishment of a stable, democratic and progressive nation-state. A military tank is seen with armed soldiers on the road leading to President Robert Mugabe's office in Harare. Credit at 5:54 a.m. The Associated Press reports that Zimbabwe's War Veterans Association has called the army's actions a bloodless correction. Chris Musvangwa, chairman of the War Veterans Group, told the app in Johannesburg that Army General Constantino Chiwenga has carried out a bloodless correction of gross abuse of power. Musbangwa said the army will return Zimbabwe to genuine democracy and make the country a modern model nation. Musbangwa and the war veterans are staunch allies of Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was fired from his post of vice president by Mugabe last week. 5:34 a.m. Reuters says Zimbabwean soldiers and armored vehicles have blocked roads to the main government offices, parliament and the courts in central Harare. Nearby, some Zimbabweans queued for cash outside banks while public taxis ferried commuters to work. A military tank is seen with armed soldiers on the road leading to President Robert Mugabe's office in Harare on Wednesday morning. Credit app armed soldiers search a vehicle on the road leading to President Robert Mugabe's office in Harare. Credit app 4:55 a.m. The televised statement made by Zimbabwe Major General S.B. Moyo, Chief of Staff Logistics: "We wish to assure the nation that His Excellency the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, and Commander-in-Chief of Zimbabwe Defense Forces, Comrade R.G. Mugabe, and his family are safe and sound and their security is guaranteed. We are only targeting criminals around him who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice. As soon as we have accomplished our mission, we expect that the situation will return to normalcy." To the civil servants: "As you are aware, there is a plan by the same people to influence the current purging that is taking place in the political sphere to the civil service. We are against that act of injustice and we intend to protect every one of you against that." To the judiciary: "The measures underway are intended to assure that as an independent arm of the state you are able to exercise your independent authority without fear of being obstructed." 4:25 a.m. Zimbabwe's military has detained Finance Minister Ignatius Chombo, a government source told Reuters. Chombo was a leading member of the so-called G40 faction of the ruling ZANU-PF party, led by Mugabe's wife Grace, that had been vying to succeed the 93-year-old president. 4:04 a.m. Not clear if this is a full coup, but for what it's worth, every coup plotter I've interviewed rationalizes their coup attempts as not a military takeover too. https://t.kaupfswicht, Brian Klaas at Brian Klaas, November 15, 2017. 3:07 a.m. Reporters and analysts have been trying to read between the lines after the rather ambiguous statement from the army. Here is some of the reaction. 2:39 a.m. In a state TV address, Zimbabwe military officers say Mugabe is safe and criminals around him are being targeted. The army encouraged people to remain calm, but avoid unnecessary movement. 2:21 a.m. Statement happening on ZBC Now. Says President Mugabe and his family are safe, but army is targeting criminals around him. Says as soon as they are done situation will come to normalcy. Christopher Ferry at Chris Garamba, November 15, 2017. 2:19 a.m. 1:59 a.m. The UK Embassy in Harare has urged British citizens to stay indoors during the uncertain situation. Due to the uncertain situation in Harare, INCL reports of unusual military activity, we advise British nationals in the city to stay safely at home indoors until the situation becomes clearer. Monitor this account for updates. UK Zimbabwe at UK Zimbabwe, November 15, 2017. 1:56 a.m. A Harare resident has told AFP that gunfire erupted near President Robert Mugabe's private residence. From the direction of his house, we heard about 30 or 40 shots fired over 3 or 4 minutes soon after. 200 am, a resident who is close to Mugabe's mansion in the suburb of Borrowdale told AFP. 1:29 a.m. Armed Zimbabwean soldiers sit on top of a military tank in Harare in the early hours of Wednesday. Credit app: yet the capital is still mostly calm. A street scene along Robert Mugabe Road in Harare. Credit app: 1:51 a.m. The government has said little during the day as tensions mounted. In the only official word from the government, Isaac Moyo, Zimbabwe's ambassador to neighboring South Africa, earlier dismissed talk of a coup, telling Reuters that the government was intact and blaming social media for spreading false information. "There's nothing really happening. They are just social media claims." 1:25 a.m. The U.S. Embassy in Harare says it will be closed on Wednesday due to ongoing uncertainty in Zimbabwe and is monitoring the situation. Due to ongoing uncertainty in Zimbabwe, the U.S. Embassy in Harare will be minimally staffed and closed to the public on November 15. Embassy personnel will continue to monitor the situation closely. At State Dept. U.S. Embassy Harare at US Embassy Harare, November 15, 2017. It has also reportedly advised U.S. citizens to stay home and shelter in place. U.S. Embassy in Harare has just sent an email at 1:54 a.m. to U.S. citizens to stay home and shelter in place due to uncertainty. Embassy closed tomorrow. Harare, Zimbabwe. Jean G at Jean_Gordima, November 15, 2017, 12:18 a.m. The Associated Press reports that armed soldiers are assaulting passers-by in Harare, as well as soldiers loading ammunition near a group of 4 military vehicles. It said the reported explosions could be heard near the University of Zimbabwe campus. 12:06 a.m. Reuters is reporting that soldiers have taken over the state broadcaster's offices. Military personnel took over the headquarters of Zimbabwe's ZBC state broadcaster in the early hours of Wednesday, 2 members of staff and a human rights worker said, compounding speculation of a coup. Some ZBC members of staff were manhandled when soldiers occupied the premises, the sources said. However, staff were told they should not worry as the soldiers were merely there to protect the site, one source added. 12:01 a.m. Reports are emerging of at least 3 explosions in Zimbabwe's capital Harare as military vehicles are seen in streets. Loud explosions going on in Harare right now. Military trucks very much active. Zimbabwe. Professor Changamire at 1 Changamire, November 14, 2017.